You're not boarding this aircraft.
Because
I asked about the maintenance.
My decision is final. Then document exactly why you stopped. Preserve the system alerts.
On hold.
That's the question.
Marcus Holloway had already scanned his boarding pass when Captain Diane Mercer stepped out of the jet bridge and told the gate agent not to let him aboard. The words were quiet enough that most passengers in the priority lane kept moving, but Marcus heard them clearly. He was 47, black, broad-shouldered, dressed in a charcoal travel jacket over an open-collar shirt, with a silver aviation conference badge tucked into his carry-on rather than displayed around his neck. His seat was 3A. His boarding pass was valid. Nothing about that had been checked before the captain decided he was a problem. "Is there an issue with my ticket?" Marcus asked. The gate agent, Elise Warren, looked from her screen to Mercer. Elise was 32 and had been working the podium alone since another agent left to handle a wheelchair request at the neighboring gate. "Your ticket is fine, Mr. Holloway." She lowered her voice. "Captain Mercer says she has concerns about allowing you on the aircraft." Marcus glanced through the glass toward the narrow-body jet parked outside. 20 minutes earlier, while waiting near the windows, he had watched a maintenance technician remove a panel beneath the left engine nacelle, sign something on a tablet, then return twice to the aircraft after boarding had already been announced. Marcus had spent 23 years around airline maintenance systems. As CEO of Aerovant Systems, a company that built compliance software used by carriers and repair stations, he knew the difference between ordinary turnaround work and a release that had become complicated. His mistake, apparently, had been asking about it. He had approached the podium before boarding and said only, "Do you know whether maintenance has closed the discrepancy on this aircraft?" Elise had checked the screen, seen no passenger-facing delay code, and asked why he wanted to know. Marcus explained that he had noticed maintenance returning after what appeared to be a sign-off. He had not demanded records. He had not claimed authority. He had not raised his voice. Mercer, passing behind the desk at that moment, had stopped and asked whether Marcus was trying to inspect her airplane. Now she stood 6 feet away with her captain's cap tucked beneath one arm. "You questioned the aircraft's airworthiness in front of other passengers," she said. "I'm not comfortable having you on board if you're going to challenge crew decisions during the flight." Marcus looked past her at 2 white businessmen who had been standing beside him when he first asked about the maintenance activity. One of them had joked that everyone became an aircraft mechanic after staring out an airport window long enough. Mercer had smiled at him. She had asked Marcus for his boarding pass. "I asked whether a maintenance discrepancy had been closed," Marcus said. "That's different from interfering with your crew." Mercer's expression hardened, though her voice stayed measured. "You continued after you were given an answer. I was told there was no delay. That wasn't the question." Elise shifted behind the podium. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard without touching it. Marcus noticed a line on the departure screen behind her change from boarding to final call, even though nearly 20 passengers still waited in the lane. He also noticed something else. The maintenance technician had returned again, this time with a red tag pouch folded beneath his arm. Marcus knew the pouch. Aerovant had designed the electronic workflow that accompanied that exact type of deferred maintenance control. Mercer followed his gaze. "This is exactly what I mean." Marcus turned back to her. "What do you mean?" "The monitoring, the questioning. You're making my staff uncomfortable." Marcus felt the familiar pressure to choose every word twice before speaking it once. He had spent enough years in executive rooms and maintenance hangars to know when a technical disagreement had been quietly rewritten as a behavioral problem. "Has anyone said I threatened them, blocked them, touched equipment, or refused an instruction?" Mercer did not answer directly. "I have final authority over who boards my aircraft." That part was true, and Marcus knew it. A captain could refuse transportation when there was a legitimate safety or operational concern. But authority did not make the reason beneath a decision immune from scrutiny. He slid his phone back into his jacket instead of recording her. Across the podium, Elise finally looked at him directly. "Captain," she said, "should I document this as denied boarding by crew instruction?" "Mercer, hesitated for half a beat. Yes. Elise entered the code. The printer beneath the desk clicked, then produced a narrow white slip confirming Marcus Holloway had been removed from Flight 41 at captain direction. Marcus took the paper when Elise offered it. Behind Mercer, through the glass, the maintenance technician stopped beneath the wing and stared down at his tablet as if something on the screen should not have been there. Elise had barely finished documenting the denial when Captain Mercer asked her to add another note. "Put disruptive behavior," she said. He was challenging the crew after being told the matter was handled. Marcus watched Elise's expression tighten. The description was no longer about what he had done. It was becoming the official version of why removing him had supposedly been necessary. "I didn't tell him the maintenance issue was handled," Elise said. Mercer turned toward her. "You told him there was no delay. That isn't the same thing." The captain's mouth flattened. Around them, the last passengers filed through the jet bridge while the boarding door remained open. Marcus could hear the muted whine of the auxiliary power unit through the terminal glass. He had missed flights before. What bothered him now was not losing the seat. It was watching a record take shape while everyone who could correct it still had the chance. "May I have the incident reference number?" he asked. Mercer glanced at him. "You've been denied boarding. Customer service can deal with the rest. I'm not asking for compensation. I'm asking for the number attached to the removal." Elise found it on her screen and wrote it beneath the printed denial slip. Mercer looked irritated but did not stop her. Marcus thanked Elise, then stepped away from the podium rather than give anyone grounds to describe him as refusing to leave. He walked 30 feet toward an empty charging station and opened Aerovant's customer support application on his phone. He had no administrative access to airline operational records from that device, and he would not have used it if he had. But he could see public system health notices from clients who had authorized Aerovant to receive automated fault alerts. Stonebridge Air appeared on the list. Marcus felt his stomach tighten. The airline had licensed one Aerovant maintenance module 3 years earlier before Marcus became CEO. The notice was not an aircraft-specific maintenance record. It was a software integrity warning generated when required synchronization between a carrier's maintenance control server and its electronic sign-off database failed beyond a set tolerance. The alert had been open for 11 hours. He called Aerovant's compliance director, Jonah Reed, a 51-year-old former airline quality manager. "I need you to look at Stonebridge," Marcus said, "only what we're authorized to see." Jonah did not ask why. Keyboard taps came through the speaker. "They've had synchronization failures since last night. Our system sent 3 notices." He paused. "Marcus, the acknowledgements are coming back from their server, but the closure packets aren't. Could that create false completed statuses? It could create incomplete replication. Whether anybody is actually releasing aircraft improperly, I can't tell from here." That distinction mattered. Marcus looked through the terminal glass again. The technician with the red tag pouch was now talking to another maintenance employee beside the aircraft nose. Neither looked relaxed. "Preserve our notification logs," Marcus said. "Don't contact the airline yet. I don't want anyone changing behavior because they know I'm standing at their gate." Jonah exhaled. "What happened?" Marcus considered saying nothing. Instead, he told him about the boarding denial and his question about the maintenance activity. Jonah swore under his breath, then caught himself. "You think they removed you because you noticed the sync problem? No. I think one captain removed me because she didn't like being questioned. I don't know whether the two things connect." That answer surprised Marcus with how much effort it took. Anger wanted a cleaner theory. Experience demanded a slower one. At the podium, Elise had started speaking to a Stonebridge operations supervisor who had arrived from another gate. Marcus could not hear everything, but he heard Mercer say he was creating concern about the aircraft, and the supervisor reply, "Then the captain made the right call." Neither man had spoken to Marcus. Within minutes, a disagreement about whether a maintenance item had been closed had become a passenger-threatening confidence in the flight. Elise looked across the concourse at Marcus. Then she did something small enough that Mercer missed it. She printed a second copy of the incident entry before the supervisor changed the screen. Outside, the maintenance technician suddenly raised one hand toward the cockpit and shook his head. A ramp worker stopped pulling the boarding bridge away. The departure board changed from on time to maintenance hold. Marcus looked down at the denial slip in his hand. The question he had been removed for asking had just become the airline's official reason for keeping the aircraft on the ground. The maintenance hold changed the mood at Gate C-18 faster than any argument could have. Passengers who had already settled into the cabin began reappearing through the jet bridge in small groups, carrying jackets and tote bags, while a gate announcement blamed an extended technical review. Marcus stayed near the charging station. He had no intention of approaching the aircraft again. If Stonebridge was dealing with a genuine maintenance control problem, the last thing he wanted was his boarding dispute tangled with facts nobody had verified yet. Captain Mercer returned to the podium with the operations supervisor, Nathan Cole, 44, whose radio kept producing clipped bursts from maintenance control. Cole spoke first. "Mr. Holloway, because your interaction contributed to disruption at the gate, we're moving you to a later flight while this aircraft is evaluated." Marcus held up the denial slip. "Your captain already removed me before the maintenance hold. Those are separate events." Cole glanced at Mercer. "I'm not interested in debating terminology. I am, because you're documenting cause." Elise stood behind the podium with both hands resting beside the keyboard. She had watched Cole open the incident entry, replace Mercer's original wording, and add that Marcus had continued escalating despite repeated safety guidance. No repeated guidance had occurred. Elise had heard every exchange. She also knew the system retained edit history for a limited period before nightly synchronization consolidated local notes into the central customer record. Cole asked Marcus to leave the immediate gate area. Marcus complied, but this time he stopped at the customer service desk across the concourse and filed a formal written complaint. He attached the denial slip and requested preservation of the complete incident history, including edits, timestamps, and employee identifiers. The representative accepted the request without comment and gave him a confirmation number. Once that number existed, Stonebridge had a defined record preservation obligation under its own complaint procedure. His phone rang before he reached an empty seat. Jonah's voice was flatter than before. "We found something we're required to report." Marcus straightened. "Tell me exactly what you know." "Stonebridge's server has been acknowledging maintenance synchronization packets without returning the completion signatures our interface expects. That alone is a software integrity issue. But one of our automated exception routines also shows repeated attempts to restale closure tokens after rejection. How many? Across multiple aircraft. I'm still validating the count." Marcus rubbed his thumb along the edge of the paper in his hand. "Can Aerovant determine whether any airplane flew with an invalid release?" "No. We can establish that Stonebridge's maintenance data exchange is unreliable. Their underlying maintenance records belong to them. Someone with regulatory authority has to compare the actual release documents against the aircraft movement history." There it was, the boundary Marcus needed. Aerovant had enough information to raise a safety concern, but not enough to pronounce a carrier unsafe. "Follow our reporting protocol," he said. "No shortcuts because I'm involved." Jonah hesitated. "That means notifying Stonebridge compliance and the FAA liaison simultaneously." "Yes." Marcus ended the call and immediately regretted one thing. He should have ordered the preservation review the moment he saw the first system health warning, before telling Jonah about the boarding incident. The facts were still valid, but now Marcus would have to disclose his personal dispute so nobody could later claim he had hidden a conflict. He called Jonah back and said so. Jonah agreed to add the disclosure to Aerovant's escalation record. At the gate, a maintenance controller had arrived carrying a printed release packet. The technician with the red tag pouch pointed to one line, then to his tablet. Captain Mercer leaned closer. Cole stopped talking into his radio. Elise used the distraction to open the incident audit screen. She printed the edit history Marcus had requested before the local record could be consolidated overnight. The pages showed the first note, Mercer's revised description, Cole's later changes, and the exact times attached to each. Then she placed the pages inside a Stonebridge complaint envelope and wrote Marcus's preservation confirmation number across the front. 10 minutes later, the gate display changed again. Flight 410 cancelled. Marcus looked at the notification on his phone from Aerovant Compliance. The required safety escalation had been transmitted to Stonebridge and the FAA. His removed seat no longer mattered. The record did. By the time Stonebridge posted the cancellation, the concourse had filled with displaced passengers trying to understand whether they would be rebooked that night. Marcus moved farther from gate C-18 and sat beside a shuttered coffee kiosk. He had spent years telling managers that an integrity alert was not proof of misconduct. Now that discipline was harder to maintain. His boarding denial, the maintenance hold, and Aerovant's server warnings had arrived too close together for comfort, but proximity was not causation. Jonah called again 20 minutes later. FAA acknowledgement came through. They want the raw interface logs preserved and our technical contact available. Behind him, Marcus could hear printers and the low conversation of Aerovant's compliance staff. Stonebridge also replied. Their counsel says the synchronization failures may be a vendor-side timestamp problem. Can they be right? They can be partly right, Jonah said. We found an old patch that could explain duplicate timestamps. It does not explain the stale closure tokens. Marcus leaned back against the metal seat. The distinction mattered enough to hurt. Aerovant might have contributed noise to the very data now drawing federal attention. Disclose the patch issue before they ask. Jonah went quiet. Legal will hate that. Legal can hate it accurately. It was the kind of answer Marcus usually delivered without hesitation. This time his voice came out sharper than he intended. Jonah noticed. You haven't eaten, have you? Marcus looked toward the vending machines across the concourse. That's not relevant. It becomes relevant when you start talking to me like I caused the airline problem. Marcus closed his eyes for a moment. Jonah was right, which made the correction harder. I'm sorry. Put the patch disclosure in the package and tell legal I approved it. After the call, Marcus bought a packet of almonds and a bottle of water he did not want. His sister Renee, 52 and a respiratory therapist in Baltimore, had texted twice asking whether he would still make their mother's retirement dinner the following evening. Marcus had promised he would. Their mother was 74 and had delayed the dinner once already to accommodate his travel. He typed that the flight had been canceled, erased a longer explanation, then wrote that he would find another way home. At gate C-18, Elise had finished sealing the incident history when Nathan Cole returned to the podium. "Why did you print the audit trail?" he asked. His tone remained controlled, but he stood close enough that Elise had to step sideways to reach the scanner. A preservation request was filed. You don't decide what gets preserved. I didn't decide. The request number is in the system. Cole held out his hand for the envelope. Elise hesitated. That hesitation was enough to tell Mercer something unusual was inside. "Give it to operations," Mercer said. Elise did, but not before scanning the envelope into the complaint file. Cole walked away with the paper copy, leaving a digital record that the pages had existed and had been transferred to him. It was not perfect protection. It was better than none. Marcus knew nothing about that exchange yet. What he did know came from Jonah 30 minutes later. Stonebridge had sent Aerovant a formal demand to suspend external distribution of the interface alerts until the carrier completed an internal review. The letter framed the issue as a disputed vendor defect and warned that premature conclusions could cause material reputational harm. "They're asking us to stop cooperating with the FAA?" Marcus said. "Not in those words. They're asking us to route everything through their counsel." Marcus stood and began walking without realizing it. The departure board slid past above him, rows of green and amber destinations. Anger pushed him toward an answer before judgment caught up. Send the demand to every Aerovant client using the module. I want them warned about the token issue tonight. Jonah interrupted. No, we haven't established whether their configuration is unique. You'd create a fleet-wide panic based on one client's anomaly. Marcus stopped beside a darkened newsstand. It was his first bad decision of the day, and Jonah had stopped it before it became an expensive one. You're right, Marcus said. Keep the notice limited to required reporting and internal validation. A new Aerovant message appeared while they were still connected. Stonebridge's maintenance server had just attempted another synchronization. This time, the rejected token carried a closure identifier linked to an aircraft that had departed earlier that morning. Marcus read the identifier twice. Flight 41 was no longer the important airplane. Jonah sent the aircraft identifier through Aerovant's secure compliance channel instead of reading it over the phone. Marcus opened the message beside the darkened newsstand and compared the registration number against Stonebridge's public departure history. The aircraft had flown 2 sectors that morning and was now scheduled for a third from Denver. That still did not prove an invalid maintenance release. It did prove the synchronization problem could not be treated as an isolated inconvenience on Flight 41. FAA wants a joint technical call, Jonah said. Their principal maintenance inspector is bringing someone from flight standards. Stonebridge is joining too. When? 8 minutes. Marcus walked toward an unused business lounge near the end of the concourse where the airport noise fell to a muffled wash behind a glass partition. He stopped before entering. I shouldn't be on that call as the technical lead. I'm now a complainant in a separate incident involving Stonebridge. Jonah understood immediately. I'll take technical. Priya can handle compliance. Priya Shah, Aerovant's 43-year-old chief compliance officer, had already reviewed the escalation package. When the call opened, Marcus joined only long enough to identify himself, disclose the boarding dispute, and state that he would not participate in determining the meaning of Stonebridge's maintenance data. Then he muted his line. It was an uncomfortable choice. Aerovant was his company to lead, and every instinct told him to stay close to the facts. But keeping distance was now part of protecting them. The FAA inspector asked Stonebridge's maintenance director to explain why closure acknowledgments were reaching Aerovant without corresponding signed completion packets. The director blamed the vendor interface first, then acknowledged that Stonebridge had been using a manual reconciliation procedure whenever its central server lagged. Priya asked whether that procedure required a second-person review before an aircraft returned to service. A pause followed. It depends on the category of discrepancy, the director said. Jonah opened one of the rejected token records. This identifier came from an item categorized as return to service critical. Stonebridge's counsel objected that Aerovant could not know what paperwork existed outside its system. Jonah agreed. We don't. That's exactly why we reported it. Marcus listened with his arms folded. The exchange mattered because nobody was claiming a smoking gun. The software had exposed a gap. Only Stonebridge's records could show whether licensed personnel had properly closed it. At Gate C-18, Elise finally reached Marcus by phone. She had found his number through the complaint confirmation, using an internal customer contact function that allowed agents to follow up on disrupted travel. Mr. Holloway, I need to tell you something about the incident record. Marcus moved away from the conference speaker. Go ahead. The wording was edited after you left the podium, more than once. He looked through the glass toward the gate. Did you preserve the audit history? I printed it and scanned the complaint envelope before operations took the paper copy. That answer loosened something in his chest. Don't send anything to me personally. Keep it inside Stonebridge's process. Elise sounded surprised. You don't want the pages? I want them where nobody can say I altered or selected them. She was quiet for a moment. Understood. Before ending the call, she added one more fact. The maintenance technician, who had delayed Flight 41 had refused to certify the aircraft after seeing a closure status he could not match to the signed work package. He had escalated to maintenance control, which was why the flight had been canceled. Marcus returned to the technical call just as the FAA inspector reached the same issue from another direction. Stonebridge had now produced several aircraft records containing electronic closure statuses that could not immediately be reconciled with the corresponding authorized signatures. The inspector did not order the airline shut down. Not yet. Instead, he directed Stonebridge to place the affected aircraft under an immediate maintenance control hold while the carrier demonstrated which releases could be independently verified. The initial list contained 11 airplanes. Stonebridge's operations director protested that grounding them simultaneously would disrupt hundreds of passengers and crews. The inspector's answer was procedural rather than dramatic. Then verify them. Marcus looked through the terminal glass at Flight Force 110 sitting under floodlights with its jet bridge still attached. Minutes earlier, Stonebridge had treated his question as the disruption. Now the same question had become the condition for putting 11 aircraft back into service. The 11 aircraft hold hit Stonebridge's evening schedule like a wrench dropped into moving machinery. Crews were reassigned, departure slots disappeared, and gate agents began reading from contingency notices that changed faster than passengers could process them. Marcus remained near C-18 because every available seat to Baltimore had vanished. The irony was not lost on him. He had been removed from one flight as a supposed threat to operations, and now he was watching an actual operational crisis unfold without touching a single Stonebridge decision. Jonah called with the next update. They've verified 4 aircraft. 2 more have complete paper packages but mismatched timestamps. 5 still have missing signatures in the records Stonebridge sent to the FAA. Are the 5 all from the same maintenance station? 3 are, 2 aren't. That made the easy explanation weaker. A single local supervisor could create a bad habit. A scattered pattern suggested either a shared procedure or a system that encouraged the same shortcut in more than one place. Marcus asked whether Aerovant could determine who submitted the stale tokens. Jonah said only at the account level, not the individual signer level. Stonebridge controlled that layer. The limit frustrated Marcus, but he was beginning to appreciate it. A system that revealed everything to a vendor would have created a different kind of danger. At the gate, Nathan Cole was no longer speaking with passengers. He stood behind the podium with a regional operations manager, trying to reconstruct which aircraft could still cover the night schedule if the hold expanded. Captain Mercer remained nearby, though Flight Force 110 had no chance of leaving. Elise was answering rebooking questions when Mercer leaned toward her and said, "This is what happens when technical concerns get amplified before they're understood." Elise stopped typing. The mechanic stopped the airplane. "I know that." And the FAA hold came from the maintenance records. Mercer looked at her, irritation replacing the practiced calm she had used with Marcus. "I'm talking about how situations spread. People start asking questions in public, confidence drops, then everyone reacts before the facts are settled." Elise did not argue. She had already learned that direct resistance only gave Mercer another chance to describe disagreement as attitude. Instead, she opened Marcus's complaint file and confirmed the scanned envelope was still attached. The audit history remained there, including the first version that described him only as questioning maintenance status and the later language that labeled him disruptive. Across the concourse, Marcus's sister called. "You sound like you're still at the airport," Renee said. "I am. You said you'd find another way. I'm trying." She paused long enough for Marcus to hear carts rolling in the hospital corridor behind her. Mom asked whether she should move dinner again. "No." "Then stop solving every problem in the building and solve the one where you get home." Marcus almost told her the FAA was involved. Almost explained why leaving felt irresponsible when Aerovant software sat inside the chain now being examined. Instead, he looked at the half-eaten almonds beside him. "I can take the train from Philadelphia if I get that far." That sounded almost like a plan. He smiled despite himself. "Don't get used to it." When the call ended, a message from Priya arrived. Stonebridge had supplied the manual reconciliation procedure it used during server lag. The document required a licensed maintenance controller to compare the electronic closure against the signed work package before release. The procedure itself was reasonable. The problem was that one section of the audit sample showed closures posted before the second-person check was completed. That was more serious than a software mismatch, but still not enough to establish how widespread the practice was. The FAA ordered a live verification test. Stonebridge would select one aircraft from the held group, reconstruct the full maintenance release from source documents, identify every authorization step, and demonstrate that the electronics matched the signed package. FAA inspectors would observe remotely while an on-site maintenance supervisor handled the records. Aerovant's role was limited to showing what its interface had received and when. Jonah asked Marcus whether he wanted to watch. "No," Marcus said. "You and Priya handle it." "You sure?" Marcus looked toward Mercer, then toward Elise, then out at Flight 4 scene under the ramp lights. "If the test fails, it needs to fail without me in the room." 40 minutes later, Jonah called back. The first aircraft passed. The second did not. Its electronic release showed complete 27 minutes before the required maintenance controller had signed the underlying work package. Stonebridge's counsel called it a documentation timing defect. The FAA inspector asked whether the aircraft had departed during that 27-minute gap. Nobody answered immediately. Then the movement record appeared. It had. The departure timestamp changed the verification from a paperwork exercise into an accountability test. Priya called Marcus from Aerovant's conference bridge and kept her voice precise. Stonebridge has confirmed the aircraft pushed back 19 minutes after the electronic release posted and 8 minutes before the required maintenance controller signed the source package. They're arguing the work itself may already have been complete. May have been? They have the mechanic's task entry. They do not yet have a contemporaneous second-person verification. Marcus stood near the terminal windows while a cleaning crew worked around abandoned cups and charging cords. Then don't characterize the maintenance as incomplete. Characterize the release sequence as unverified. That's what we're doing. The distinction felt almost absurdly narrow, compared with the constellations stacking across the departure board. But Marcus knew narrow language was what kept a difficult fact from becoming an exaggerated one. Aerovant could show when its interface received a status. Stonebridge had to prove whether its required internal checks existed before the airplane moved. The FAA had to decide what that failure meant operationally. A second live test began on another aircraft. This time, an FAA inspector asked Stonebridge's maintenance controller to start from the signed work card instead of the electronic status. The controller located the mechanic's completion entry, then searched for the required independent review. 10 seconds became 30. Someone on Stonebridge's side muted a microphone, then returned with a different document number. Jonah spoke only when asked. Aerovant received the closure token at 14:06 Central. The Stonebridge controller answered, "Our signed verification is 14:22. The FAA inspector asked when the aircraft left the gate. Stonebridge's operations representative said 14:15. Nobody needed Marcus to interpret those times. At C-18, Elise was finally relieved from the podium by another agent. She carried her water bottle to an employee workstation several gates away, where Nathan Cole found her before she could sit down. "Corporate wants statements from everyone involved with Holloway. I already documented mine. They want a fresh statement." Elise looked at him. "Why?" Cole lowered his voice. "Because the original incident entry is now part of a complaint, and we need clean accounts that separate the passenger issue from this maintenance situation." "That sounds reasonable." Relief crossed his face too quickly. Elise continued. "As long as my statement includes the fact that Captain Mercer stopped his boarding after he asked about the unresolved maintenance activity before the flight was placed on hold." Cole's shoulders settled. "You're connecting two things we don't know are connected." "I'm describing the order they happened." He stared at her for a moment, then nodded toward the workstation. "Write exactly what you remember." Elise did. She included Marcus's question, Mercer's response, the absence of threats or physical interference, and the later edits to the incident record. She also noted that she had no knowledge of the aircraft's technical condition. The statement helped Marcus without pretending she knew more than she did, which was precisely why it carried weight. The federal call moved to Stonebridge's written maintenance control procedure. The FAA inspector read one section aloud, then asked the carrier's director whether aircraft could legally be released under company policy before the second-person review was recorded. "No," the director said. "Is there any approved alternate procedure for the outages you experienced yesterday?" Another pause. "Not for this class of maintenance item." That answer did more than the timestamps had. The first test could have been dismissed as a documentation anomaly. The second aircraft showed the same sequence. Stonebridge's own policy established that the sequence was not permitted. The FAA did not announce a shutdown. Instead, the inspector ordered Stonebridge to suspend dispatch of every aircraft whose maintenance release had passed through the affected reconciliation process until the carrier could verify each source package against its movement history. Stonebridge estimated the scope at 36 aircraft, more than half its active fleet that evening. The operations representative objected. "You're effectively stopping the airline." "We are stopping unverified releases," the inspector replied. "Your verified aircraft may continue operating." Marcus heard the difference immediately. The title people would eventually use would be bigger than the regulatory language. The actual decision was narrower and more serious because it could be defended. Then Priya sent him the updated fleet list. Flight 410 was on it, but so were aircraft in 6 other cities. What had begun at one gate was no longer about whether Marcus Holloway deserved to board. Stonebridge now had to prove which of its airplanes deserved to leave the ground. By 10:40 p.m., Stonebridge had verified 13 aircraft and failed to clear 9 others before their scheduled departures. The rest remained under review. The result was operationally brutal but procedurally clean. Aircraft with complete traceable releases could fly. Those without them could not. Marcus watched departure times disappear from the board in clusters while buses carried stranded passengers toward hotels. No dramatic order had closed the company. A regulator had imposed a condition Stonebridge could not satisfy quickly enough. Priya called with the formal language. FAA has directed Stonebridge to cease dispatch using the affected maintenance release process until an acceptable verification method is demonstrated. Aircraft cleared through independent source document review are exempt. Marcus pressed his thumb against the bridge of his nose, so operations can continue on the verified fleet. In theory, they don't have enough aircraft or positioned crews to maintain the schedule. Corporate has canceled the remaining overnight departures. That distinction mattered. Stonebridge had not lost its operating certificate. It had effectively shut down its scheduled operation for the night because the carrier could not reliably identify which maintenance releases met its own approved procedure. Marcus asked Priya to make sure Aerovant used exactly that language in every external response. She agreed, then told him the FAA had requested preservation of all interface logs from the previous 30 days. At C-18, Captain Mercer had been removed from flight duty pending review, not fired. Nathan Cole had been directed to surrender access to the passenger incident editing function while corporate compliance examined why Marcus's record had changed after the denial. Elise remained on shift long enough to answer investigators' initial questions. Nobody congratulated her. Nobody promised protection. A regional manager simply told her that scheduling would contact her before her next assignment. Marcus learned those details when Stonebridge's chief compliance officer, Teresa Vaughn, 58, called him directly. Her tone carried none of the defensive polish he had heard earlier. "Mr. Holloway, I've reviewed the original incident entry, its edit history, and Ms. Warren's statement. Based on what I have now, your boarding denial should not have been coded as disruptive behavior." Marcus looked toward the empty jet bridge. "Then, correct the record." "We are. And preserve every version. That has already been ordered." He appreciated the answer but did not soften the next question. "What happens to Mercer?" Pending review means pending review. Her decision to deny boarding, the accuracy of her account, and whether she improperly linked a technical question to a behavioral concern will be examined separately from the maintenance investigation. Marcus had spent enough years managing people to know that was the right answer, even if anger wanted a faster one. Good. Teresa then offered rebooking, hotel reimbursement, and ground transportation. Marcus accepted the hotel only long enough to shower and change before taking the earliest train east. His mother's retirement dinner was no longer something he was willing to sacrifice to remain physically close to a crisis he was not responsible for controlling. Jonah had been right about that much. Leadership did not require standing beside every fire. Before leaving the terminal, Marcus found Elise near an employee exit. She looked exhausted, her lanyard twisted around one finger. "I heard they corrected the incident code," she said. "They're correcting it." She nodded. "I should have challenged the wording sooner." Marcus considered telling her she had done enough. The sentence felt too easy. "You had a supervisor and a captain standing over your station. I understand why you hesitated. But the first version of a record matters." Elise looked toward the podium where she had spent the evening. "I know that now." "No," Marcus said gentler than before. "You knew it then. That's why you printed it." At 11:18 p.m., Stonebridge posted a public notice suspending its remaining overnight departures, while maintenance releases were independently reconciled. The FAA statement that followed was narrower, confirming regulatory oversight and restrictions on aircraft tied to the affected process. Across the terminal, passengers saw only the practical result. Stonebridge aircraft parked at gates instead of leaving them. Marcus received one final message from Priya before stepping into the airport shuttle. Aerovant's logs had helped expose the timing gap, but Stonebridge's own procedure, maintenance records, employee decisions, and source document failures had established the problem. That mattered to him more than any headline suggesting one black CEO had made a call and brought down an airline. He folded the original denial slip once and put it back in his jacket. For the first time that night, it was no longer the most important record in the story. Marcus reached Philadelphia before sunrise and spent the last leg home watching Stonebridge's operation rebuild itself in fragments. 13 verified aircraft became 17, then 21. Each one returned only after a maintenance controller matched the electronic release to the signed source package and an independent reviewer confirmed the sequence. The airline's public schedule still looked wounded, but the repair was finally happening in the same language as the failure. Aircraft by aircraft, signature by signature, without pretending a statement could substitute for verification. At Aerovant, Priya sent Marcus a summary before he boarded the train south. The FAA had required Stonebridge to keep the affected reconciliation process suspended while the carrier submitted a corrective action plan. Regulators had also ordered a broader sample of prior releases, not because every release was presumed defective, but because the repeated timing gaps had established enough of a pattern to justify deeper review. Aerovant's interface patch remained part of the investigation, and Marcus insisted its contribution be examined alongside Stonebridge's procedures. Jonah called while Marcus was standing in the cafe car with a paper cup of coffee. Our engineers reproduced the duplicate timestamp bug. Marcus felt a familiar tightening behind his ribs. Does it change the release sequence? No. It can duplicate how one event appears in a secondary log, but it cannot create a maintenance controller signature or move that signature backward in time. So we own the bug. We own the bug, Jonah said. Stonebridge owns what they did around it. Marcus looked out at warehouses sliding past the window. That was less satisfying than complete innocence and more useful than denial. Issue the client advisory after Priya signs it. Explain exactly what the patch can and cannot affect. Jonah laughed once. You know that sentence is going to make 3 departments miserable. They'll recover. At Stonebridge headquarters, Teresa Vaughn was conducting a different review. Elise's preserved audit history had become central to the passenger complaint because it showed Marcus's record changing after he left the podium. Nathan Cole admitted he had rewritten the note because he believed disruptive behavior would better justify the captain's decision if the passenger challenged it later. He insisted he had been protecting the operation, not targeting Marcus. Teresa asked why protection required adding conduct no witness could substantiate. Cole had no answer that improved with repetition. Captain Mercer's interview was more complicated. She maintained that Marcus's questioning had made her concerned he would challenge crew authority on board. She also acknowledged that he had followed every instruction, stepped away when asked, and made no threat. When Teresa asked whether Mercer would have made the same decision if one of the two businessmen beside Marcus had asked the maintenance question, Mercer stopped speaking for several seconds. "I don't know," she finally said. It was not an apology. It was the first honest uncertainty in her account. Elise was temporarily reassigned from solo gate duty while compliance completed its review. She initially read the move as punishment and nearly resigned. Teresa met her in person before that happened and explained that the reassignment was intended to keep Cole and Mercer's management chain away from her scheduling until investigators finished interviewing witnesses. Elise asked for that protection in writing. Teresa gave it to her. 3 days later, Stonebridge restored most of its schedule under a temporary verification protocol requiring dual confirmation for every maintenance release touched by the failed synchronization process. The airline published cancellation refunds automatically instead of forcing passengers to request them individually. It also created a separate review of incident record editing permissions after compliance found that Cole's changes were technically allowed but insufficiently traceable at the supervisory level. Marcus attended his mother's retirement dinner one day late. Renee had saved him a seat beside the kitchen doorway, close enough that he could carry plates when their mother complained. Everyone was treating her like a guest in her own house. For 2 hours, Marcus talked about hospital stories, retirement travel, and whether the cake had too much frosting. Nobody asked him about Stonebridge until the dishes were stacked. His mother looked at him then. "Did they let you back on the plane?" Marcus smiled. "Not that one." She accepted the answer without needing the rest. The following morning, Teresa sent Marcus the corrected passenger record. The phrase disruptive behavior had been removed. In its place was a plain account stating that boarding had been denied after a disagreement concerning a maintenance status inquiry and that subsequent review found no threatening or non-compliant conduct by the passenger. Marcus read it once, then forwarded it to no one. The first record had tried to turn his questions into the problem. The corrected one did something quieter and harder. It admitted where the problem had actually begun. 6 weeks after Flight 417 never left the gate, Stonebridge's maintenance review produced a finding more complicated than the first night's headlines. No inspector concluded that every aircraft touched by the failed synchronization process had been unsafe to fly. What the FAA did establish was that Stonebridge had allowed an unapproved reconciliation practice to develop around a software outage, and that several aircraft had been released before the carrier could demonstrate completion of its own required second-person verification. The restriction stayed in place until Stonebridge replaced that workaround, retrained its maintenance controllers, and proved through repeated sample audits that the signed source documents and electronic status matched before dispatch. The consequences spread according to responsibility rather than spectacle. Nathan Cole lost his supervisory role after investigators confirmed he had altered Marcus's passenger record to describe behavior witnesses had not observed. He later resigned rather than return in a non-management position. Captain Diane Mercer received a suspension and mandatory command review process after Stonebridge concluded that she had exercised legitimate boarding authority for an unsupported reason, then allowed a technical question to become a behavioral accusation. She was not punished for raising a safety concern. She was disciplined for how she treated the passenger who raised one. Elise Warren returned to gate duty with 2 changes she had requested herself. Supervisors could no longer replace an original incident narrative without preserving the prior version in a visible audit chain, and frontline employees could flag a disputed entry for compliance review without routing the request through the manager who had written it. Stonebridge also established a protected reporting channel for maintenance and customer service employees whose concerns crossed departmental lines. Teresa refused to call any of those reforms culture change until the first quarterly audit showed whether people actually used them. Aerovent had its own repair to make. Marcus authorized the timestamp patch, a technical bulletin to every client using the affected module, and an external review of how the software displayed synchronization failures during manual reconciliation. The review cost money and embarrassed an engineering team that had initially insisted the bug was irrelevant. Marcus kept the finding in the final report anyway. Aerovent had not created Stonebridge's missing verification steps, but its interface had made a messy process harder to read, and pretending otherwise would have repeated the same instinct he had spent weeks criticizing. Stonebridge reimbursed Marcus for the canceled travel and formally withdrew the disruptive behavior notation. He declined an additional confidential settlement that would have required both sides to describe the boarding dispute as resolved without further public comment. Instead, he accepted a written correction, and nothing that prevented Elise or other employees from discussing truthful accounts through authorized investigative channels. He never asked for Mercer to be fired. By then, he understood that accountability was strongest when nobody had to exaggerate it. On a mild October morning, Marcus flew again for the first time since the incident. Not Stonebridge. Not because he had sworn off the airline forever, but because another carrier had the schedule he needed. At the gate, a maintenance technician stood beneath the nose of the aircraft while boarding paused for 11 minutes. Nobody complained when the agent announced that an inspection needed additional sign-off. Marcus sat by the window and watched the technician return to the terminal door, compare something on a tablet with a paper card, then give a small nod to the gate crew. The delay cost Marcus a connection and forced him to move a meeting. He found that he did not resent it. 2 days later, Teresa sent him a short message. Stonebridge's first independent quarterly audit had passed, but the review had uncovered another issue. Employees at a regional maintenance base were using an informal shortcut that did not involve the failed software at all. The practice had not produced an unverified release, and the original Flight Force 110 investigation was closed. This was a different problem, with different people and a different mechanism. Teresa asked whether Aerovent would provide one technical observer while Stonebridge tested the revised reporting process. Marcus read the request from his seat as boarding began. Then he forwarded it to Priya with a note asking her to decide whether Aerovent could help without compromising independence. Outside the window, the technician removed the red tag only after the second signature appeared. Marcus put his phone away and fastened his seatbelt.